This is TWiT.
This is yet another chapter in the ongoing story of SolarWinds. You all remember SolarWinds. That's the enterprise and network management software that pretty much no one outside of large enterprises had heard of 2 months ago, but now everyone knows about. Why? Because it was hacked. And we're finding out that it wasn't so much, perhaps, that SolarWinds was hacked, but one of their supply chain items was hacked. This story is complicated. It is long. It is wide-reaching, and it's not nearly over. But here's a new piece of it. It turns out that one of the customers of SolarWinds was Microsoft. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise. Last time we heard 495 of the Fortune 500 were customers. So this is not saying that Microsoft was in any way wrong for being a customer. But through the account takeover aspect of this, and believe me, we're going to be talking about this account takeover a lot more. I was on a call with Department of Homeland Security earlier this week where they were talking a great deal about this complete account takeover, which means that it's an account takeover that is complete to the point that it is transparent to the management of the network. So one of these accounts that was taken over, as it turns out, had the ability to look at some Windows source code. Did not have the ability to make changes, so it could not, for example, install backdoors, but it could review the code and look carefully at it. Now, Microsoft now is aware of this. Microsoft as a company has said that viewing the source code poses no increase in security risk because its security threat models assumes attackers have some knowledge of the code. We're going to get back to that in a moment. Now, the company says that the account takeover has been remediated and that no customer data was at any time put at jeopardy. So let's take a moment to think about this. And Brian, I'm going to get your take on this first. Lou, I know you're in something of a sensitive position here, so I'm going to be careful with you. But Brian, I want to ask you, how much additional risk is there if someone can look at the code they might try to attack? Is that a significant benefit to an attacker?
Well, I put it this way. It's kind of like if you're trying to break through a bank vault, if you have the design documents on how it was put together, that's a big shortcut. So there's some risk. It's not like they're handing you the combination to the bank vault or the keys or anything like that. But when you understand the system you're trying to break into, you've got a better chance of actually succeeding. And so that's one of the big reasons why a lot of high security installations are physically air gapped. And we have this thing in the Department of Defense, or actually any military, we have a thing called capabilities and capacities. Just stating an official, say, top speed of a nuclear submarine or things like that. When you start revealing details, you start providing shortcuts to a lot of people if they want to do you harm. So that's one of the things. One of the soapboxes that I've had is there are not a whole heck of a lot of network monitoring and network management tools out there. It's a very small market, and it goes from real cheap or free, takes a big jump, and that's when we start getting into where SolarWinds lives. And then we take another ginormous jump and we start talking about carrier class management systems like Science Logic's EM7. It seems to me that there is a need for some room, some diversification in the industry that hasn't been happening. And I keep wondering, in fact, the other week, the last episode, we were talking to a venture capitalist, and he and I both kind of had the, I wonder why there isn't more competition, and maybe there needs to be. Anyway, it's basically a roadmap. If you know which way the road's going to be going, then you've got a better chance. So that's actually the direct answer to this question that you posed to me.
Well, I appreciate that. Now, Lou, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm not going to ask you about Microsoft code at all. I'm going to ask you about open source code. You have looked, because you're a professional software developer, you're aware of all the open source projects out there. And as a general rule, we know that there are people who claim that open source software is a greater security risk, although a lot of that has to do with the quality and testing of the code rather than its visibility. But let me ask this question for open source code. How much of its perceived vulnerability do you think comes from the fact that anyone can look at the code? Is that something that plays a role in its vulnerability, or is it more a programming practices thing, and the ability to look at the source code is a minor issue when it comes to open source vulnerability, or not?
I think when it comes to a hacker, most of the time, they're going to attempt to trial and error system and code the same way. And when you have open source, you can see the source code. It makes it a little easier to determine different areas of the code that are vulnerable. Like, for instance, if you're not sanitizing inputs, or if you are, using things relentlessly without checking them and validating them, that kind of thing. So I think it does make them a little bit more open to things. But again, the one thing with open source is it's so fast to recover and find these things and fix them. I think one of the biggest vulnerabilities is people who just consume them without looking through them and validating the validity of the code. Like, example, if I go and use an NPM package today that's just pure JavaScript, and I've trusted it for years, like something like, I don't know, React or jQuery or something like that in the industry, and somebody has compromised the latest package, they've added their, some of their own code in there. Most CI loops will go and consume these things and then try to run a bunch of tests and roll them out to the wild again with the latest and greatest package update, because they want to get security fixes and all that stuff. And the problem with that is that when you blindly do these things, you open yourself up to vulnerabilities. And I think, organizations have to do a much better job of validating what comes in, the changes that are coming in, why they've been changed, whether they need those changes or not, and not just blindly checking them in or taking them, that kind of thing. So when it comes to open source, there's different levels and layers of vulnerability. And I think all of them come with just, as an organization, knowing that you're using open source and that you need to validate what's coming in. So when you use it for the first time, you got to validate it. And when you consume it for the nth time, you have to validate it. And so I think that's where this comes from. And, and again, does it make it easier? It does. But again, you use it with caution, then there should be less risk.
You hit on a point that I think is going to be critical, and one of the big lessons coming out of SolarWinds. If you look at things like the FAIR model of establishing risk, you have basically, it's a complex way of looking at the likelihood that something will go wrong and weighing that in addition to the consequences of that thing going wrong and coming up with an ultimate risk. Many companies assigned far too low a score to the likelihood of third-party risk events happening when it came to a trusted partner like SolarWinds. I think this is going to cause a lot of companies to reevaluate those third-party risks. That's good. And when it's put into practice by, as Lou pointed out, validating the quality and security of code at multiple steps along the chain, that's even better. This is not by far the last we're going to hear about SolarWinds. Trust me when I say there are other shoes to drop here.